If you believe that the world's going to end at 1.5 degrees, unfortunately, we're not going to meet the 1.5 degree target. So it's very natural that you'd feel this kind of apocalyptic thinking. I think the risk there is it leads us into this binary, well, it's too late, there's nothing we can do about it. But once we go past 1.5, we need to fight for 1.6 and 1.7 and 1.8, and that will ultimately reduce the impacts and save lives. So I think we need to think of it more as a spectrum of increasing risk rather than necessarily strict thresholds.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is a data scientist. Hannah Ritchie has written a book called Not the End of the World, and that might give you a clue as to what her arguments are about. She's basically telling us that we don't need to think that we can't have children, that the world is about to end, that climate change means we may not have a future ourselves, because if you look at the data over a long period of time, it tends to tell a different story. And she's laid it out very clearly over a number of topics in this book, and is also now quite a common fixture on various TV and radio programs, articulating the same things. So Hannah, thank you very much for coming in.
Lovely to be here.
How did this come about? Have you been sort of watching the arguments of Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg and saying you are unnecessarily worrying people?
No, not necessarily. So my background is environmental science. I feel like I've been a kid that grew up always with climate change. I don't really remember a time when it wasn't really on my radar. I think I've always been really anxious about climate change. And then I went on to study environmental science at university. I think I found myself in a place after my degree programme where I felt more helpless than ever. I felt like these problems were getting worse and worse and worse, and there was really absolutely nothing that we could do about it. So despite being really highly motivated to work on these environmental topics, I kind of felt left with nothing, and I was in a really anxious and quite depressed state. And I think over the last 10 years or so, I've been working as a data scientist on these topics, and I think there is some cautious cause for hope there. Not that these problems aren't big or that we're on the right trajectory, but I think there are some reasons for cautious optimism that we can solve them. And I think what I've seen recently, and I think I speak to other climate scientists who have seen the same, where we seem to have, on these topics, flipped very quickly from a state of almost semi-denial or skepticism to kind of a 180 to it's too late.
Total doom.
Yeah, there's nothing we can do about it. And I think the reality is that there's a whole spectrum of scenarios in the middle there. Like the late climate scientist Stephen Snyder said, good for us or the end of the world are the least likely outcomes. So there's a whole spectrum of outcomes there where we'll probably land, and it's completely within our power to determine where on that spectrum that we land. So I think with the book, what I'm trying to show is, yes, these are big and really serious problems and will affect large numbers of people, but there is something that we can actually do about it.
I mean, because the obvious instant criticism is, well, you're minimising massive problems, and that's not helpful.
Yeah, and I'm not, if you take the example of climate change, I'm very clear in the book, we're on the trajectory for 2.5 to 3 degrees, which is well above our targets and completely unacceptable. If you look at where we were a decade ago, going into the Paris Agreement, we were talking about 3.5 to 4 degrees. Now, we shouldn't sit back and say, oh, well done us, because we're now on a good trajectory. We're not. We're on a pretty catastrophic trajectory. But we can actually acknowledge that some progress has been made and use that progress to understand how we make more of it, because we need to drive that curve down. We need to get as close to 2 degrees or below as possible. But I take the point, it's actually very, very hard to strike this balance of showing people not the end of the world, all hope. It's not that all hope is lost, without leading people into a sense of complacency. That balance is very difficult.
Now, for people who aren't sure, what is a data scientist? I mean, do you do any original research?
Some of us are academic researchers, so I'm based at the University of Oxford, but we don't actually necessarily do original research that you would classify as a scientist doing. The way I see us is we kind of sit between academia and research and the public, journalists, policymakers. And what we try to do is bridge that gap. There's loads of amazing research there that answer really fundamental questions about our world. But the issue is that they're in academic papers that no one reads or spreadsheets. So what we try to do is bring it out into the world to help people make better decisions, to understand the world around them.
So being in an academic environment in which you also interface with the media a lot, you must understand the temptation to catastrophize because it attracts attention. It makes people sit up and take notice, especially around issues that people may feel have been ignored, or that you haven't been realizing what's going on. It's the don't look up thing, or, or various Hollywood films that have looked into this, The Day After Tomorrow, or whatever it is, that says, look at this, it might happen.
Yeah.
Are they just generally wrong? That the catastrophe isn't usually the end point.
I get the temptation. I think for many people in this position, they feel like there's this big disaster looming, which is completely true, and they kind of, at the end of their tether, how do we get people to wake up and take action because we've been too slow on that? So I get the temptation to do that. My risk with that, especially as a scientist, is that the world will only act on climate change, and we'll have to sustain this action over decades and decades and decades if they have trust that scientists are telling the truth. Now, if there is the sense that scientists have exaggerated or many of the claims are too extreme, then you can very easily lose trust in the science, and you can have this backfire effect. So I think that's one risk. And it's not that climate scientists are exaggerating.
And has that happened?
I think some of the claims, yes, are go beyond.
Give me some examples.
So Roger Hallam, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, saying the science says 6 billion people will die this century. Now, scientists have very strongly pushed back on that because there's nothing in the science that says that is the case. There are a range of claims about people, we lock in our climate future in the next 5 years. There's always these deadlines. And I think that's just not backed up by the science. And I'm not like the first climate scientist to, like a range of much better climate scientists than I have tried to push back on that and say, yes, this is very serious. We're not moving fast enough. This is a big problem. But some of the really extreme claims are not helping. One, they are potentially having a backfire effect. And two, they have a really profound impact on people's mental health. Like I get emails from a range of people who feel like they have no future and they feel like they don't want to go to college or university because, what's the point in investing in a future? Some of them are suicidal. And they link to these YouTube videos or articles where they make these really extreme claims and they're just not true. So that's what I'm trying to push back on.
And there are all these conversations around, well, we shouldn't have children, it would be irresponsible. I mean, the sort of the catastrophizing that's going on in a lot of young people, it's very dangerous, isn't it?
I mean, the question of having children is a very contentious one, and I think it's really important that we don't police people's reproductive positions on either end of the spectrum. But I think the point is that young people are making really life-changing decisions based on what they think the future is going to look like. Now, with climate change, the future is very, very uncertain. But I think we need to try to be as honest as we possibly can and relaying these are the risks, these are the potential futures that we might inherit, but not push that to the extreme. The example I give is that I know loads of climate scientists that are still having kids, and they're the ones, in the front seat. They know better than anyone what that future might look like, and they are still choosing to have kids.
So what are the sort of the big misconceptions around climate change, do you think? I mean, because obviously the conversation, it tends to sort of revolve around the 2050 target, the sort of the stopping 2 degrees of warming. Do you think we sort of focus on the wrong things? That sort of if we hit 2 degrees of warming, that's suddenly the end of the world, when in fact it's not.
I think some people view 1.5 degrees as this cliff, that once we reach 1.5 degrees, we tip into a climate that just goes way out of control and, kind of that's the end. And I think that's not how the science works. The way climate works is that it is basically a gradient or a spectrum where with each incremental point of warming, you get increased impacts and increased risks. And those don't necessarily scale linearly. So going from 1 degree to 1.5 degrees is not the same as going from 1.5 to 2 degrees. You would expect the impact would be higher. So they don't scale linearly, but it's a gradient. It's not necessarily a cliff that we just suddenly fall off. And I think that's really important for how we frame action on climate change. If you believe that the world is going to end at 1.5 degrees, unfortunately, we're not going to meet the 1.5 degree target. So it's very natural that you'd feel this kind of apocalyptic thinking. I think the risk there is it leads us into this binary, well, it's too late, there's nothing we can do about it. But once we go past 1.5, we need to fight for 1.6 and 1.7 and 1.8, and that will ultimately reduce the impacts and save lives. So I think we need to think of it more as a spectrum of increasing risk rather than necessarily strict thresholds.
I mean, your approach was sort of turned around by a man who's sat in that chair, in fact, Hans Rosling, who had a very compelling way of presenting data that would confound a lot of the assumptions that we tend to hold. Just explain why he changed the way you think.
Yeah, so I think as I said, my background is environmental science. So when you look at all those trends, they're just getting worse and worse. And I think the issue I had at the time is that I was really extrapolating those trends and just assuming that all of the kind of human well-being trends were getting worse and worse as well. So I just felt like the world was kind of going the wrong direction on all of these trends, and there was really no hope for the future. And then I discovered the work of Hans Rosling, where he didn't really focus as much on the environmental metrics, but on the kind of human progress metrics. He used data to show that over the last few centuries, we've made amazing progress on these issues. I mean, the world is still very unequal today, and we're not where we want to be, but really profound and dramatic changes. You know, like 200 years ago, or almost half of children would die before reaching the age of 5. That's now less than 5%. So we've seen these really profound drivers of human progress. The issue there is that human progress has basically come at the cost of the environment, right? A lot of that progress has been driven by energy, by fossil fuels. We've expanded farmland at the cost of forests and wild habitats. So we're now in a position where we've kind of tipped the scales in the other direction. I think the hypothesis I'm putting forward in the book is I think we're actually now in this really unique position where I think we can do both of these things at the same time. I think we can continue to improve human well-being and human progress across the world while also addressing our environmental impact and environmental footprint. And I think that's a really unique opportunity that we have.
And your argument is that we've never really been sustainable. So it's not that we'll ever be returning to sustainability, it's that sustainability is something we might be able to achieve.
Yeah, I think if you're looking at it in terms of this balance of human well-being and environmental impact, like our ancestors probably had a very low environmental impact, but often many of the human progress measures were poor. Over the last few centuries, that's tipped the other direction. And I think we are now in a unique position because we have technologies, we have tools at our disposal that we can achieve both of these things.
So let's go through the topics you've looked at in the book, because you're an environmental specialist, but you've looked at air pollution, climate change, deforestation, food, biodiversity, ocean plastics, and overfishing, all of which are topics that get a huge amount of attention in the media. So can we sort of canter through them, if you like, and give me some sort of reasons to be more cheerful? Air pollution first, then.
I mean, air pollution is both a really underrated environmental and health problem for me, but also one where we've made a lot of progress in many ways. So there's a couple of really big air pollution problems that we have basically solved. Like a couple of decades ago, was the ozone layer was the kind of climate change of its day. We don't really talk about that anymore because we solved it. And that required international action at a very, very large scale. That wasn't just one country acting. The whole world had to work together to do that. Another one there is acid rain, where across Europe and North America, that was essentially a solved problem. And then there's kind of diverging trends on local air pollution. So in rich countries, for instance, air pollution levels have fallen a lot, especially over the last 50 years. Now, in the UK, we still have tens of thousands of premature deaths every year. So that's why I say it's also an underrated problem, because I think people just don't have that on the radar. But we have massively cut the number of people dying from air pollution. At a global level, we have there are a range of estimates for how many people die prematurely, but they're all in the millions, and the kind of median estimate from the World Health Organization is like 7 million. So you have 7 million premature deaths from air pollution every year. So it's a massive, massive problem. But there are real trends to show us that it's possible to reduce that and reduce that even further.
To what extent do all of these things need more global cooperation? I mean, we don't have a world government, and countries do different things. So the question is always sort of, well, what's the point of us doing this if over there they do something different or ignore it?
Yeah, I think the role of rich countries in particular in this scenario is one, if you take climate change, is to get our carbon emissions as close to zero as we can, as quickly as we can. But what will drive this change is being able to replace fossil fuels or, petrol cars with alternatives. And those alternatives need to be very, very cheap, right? This won't work if those alternatives are more expensive than fossil fuels. The role of rich countries is therefore not only just domestically, but to drive innovation and deployment of these technologies so that they drive down the cost for other countries to follow. So there is like a framework by which if the UK can help drive down the cost of solar or wind or electric vehicles, they would not only improve air quality in the UK, they would also make it cheaper for China or India or other countries that are further down the income distribution to do that process much, much quicker than we did. So I think that is a really important for rich countries to consider as their contribution, not just domestically, but how they can play a bigger role.
So what does the data tell you then about what's the right thing to do at a time of economic depression, as we've seen over the last few years in Britain, where the temptation of governments is to slow down their environmental advances and measures and regulations because they feel the country can't afford it?
I think that's a mistake. I think the notion that kind of economic growth or economic prosperity is at odds with environmental action is simply wrong. I think there was possibly some truth to that 10, 15 years ago. So if you go back 10, 15 years, solar, wind, batteries, electric cars were way, way more expensive than fossil fuels. What we've seen over the last decade is that the cost of these have plummeted, and they're now in many cases undercutting the cost of coal or gas, which means that there's no longer this really tight kind of economic trade-off between taking action on climate or providing people with cheap energy. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons or biggest reasons for hope that we can get going on it much, much faster. For me, the last decade has really been about just being able to enter the climate race, right? Our tools have only just entered the race on climate change, and we're now in the position where they're cheap, they're cost effective, and we need to build very, very quickly. But I think this framing of that these two things are at odds is actually really counterproductive.
So in the last few days, we've seen the head of Toyota telling us that our whole, emerging belief system around electric cars being the future is wrong, and that there will always have to be petrol cars. Toyota, of course, tried to sort of go down the hybrid route and the hydrogen route, but that hasn't been as fast growing perhaps now as electric cars or EVs. Is he just wrong then?
Yeah, he's wrong. He's wrong because Toyota are now really far behind the curve. So he's trying to shift the market in his favor. I think the issue that many kind of big car manufacturers have had is that they've been sleepwalking. They've really took their foot off the gas. They've not been watching the evolving trends. And now the world is going to shift towards electric cars, and they're far behind. I think like a big transition here has been that China has now come on the scene. They're making really good electric cars, very, very cheap. Like the cost of a pretty good electric car, not like a golf caddy, like a good electric car in China is like $10,000 to $15,000. Now, they wouldn't be sold at that price in Europe or the US because we would have protections for our kind of domestic manufacturers and markets. But I think there are a lot of car manufacturers that are now behind the curve and are really going to struggle to catch up. But I think the world is moving in that direction.
Will we ultimately have to stop burning things? Or can we carry on?
No, we'll have to stop burning things, but that's a good thing.
But the practicalities of the transition are quite difficult, aren't they? It is difficult getting people to replace central heating systems in their homes, and expensive, with electric heat pumps. A lot of people aren't even convinced that they'll get warm enough homes from heat pumps. So you've got a sort of a philosophical battle to win before you've got the financial hurdle. Is there any sort of way in which the data helps us look at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to convey that this is not going to be easy, and I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that it's going to be easy. That's why I think this we will just transition. We need to do this in the next 5 years. It's just unrealistic because it's kind of completely reshaping our energy system and our heating and even our food system. So it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be really, really quick. But I think there are a range of trends there that give us some cause for hope. I think on electricity, it's very clear that we can build low-carbon electricity system pretty cheaply, and cheaper than coal or gas, and without the volatility of those markets, which I think for many countries has been another call to action to work on this.
So when Labour says it'll decarbonise electricity by 2030, that's doable, is it?
It's ambitious, but it's doable, yes.
Deforestation is your chapter 4. So what's the good news on deforestation?
I think the good news on deforestation is that many temperate countries are well past the peak of deforestation. In fact, many are regrowing forests. So the UK, for example, we cut down our forests centuries ago, one for wood or for kind of naval equipment, and then especially for expanding agricultural land. That's now stopped, and we're now regrowing forests, and that tends to be a trend across many temperate countries. Deforestation is still a massive issue in the tropics, and that's where most deforestation is happening today. But we do think that globally, deforestation probably peaked a few decades ago. Now it's falling, and it's falling quite slowly. But there are viable ways by which we can possibly get to very low or zero deforestation by 2030. I think one encouraging trend there is the Brazilian Amazon, where deforestation peaked kind of early 2000s. Now it then fell by 75% under Lula da Silva. There was a brief period of kind of pretty low rates, and then it went up again under Bolsonaro. But Lula da Silva has taken office again, and now over last year it's fell by 50%. So these are problems where you can actually make pretty good progress pretty quickly.
And it is, of course, totally related to food, which is the other big environmental issue, I suppose, and climate change issue, because a lot of that deforestation is for agriculture.
Yeah, I think that's often a misconception, that people think deforestation is for building cities or other activities. The leading drivers has always been farmland and expanding agricultural land. And I think food, in general, our food systems are underrated as an environmental driver. They're big on climate change. A quarter of our greenhouse gas emissions come from food systems. It's the leading driver of deforestation, leading driver of biodiversity loss. 70% of global freshwater withdrawals are for agriculture. We use half of the world's habitable land. Our food system is a really big environmental problem.
So where's the positive story there then?
On food, there are some reasons for cautious optimism, but I think it will much more strongly rely on kind of individual behaviour change, which I think for food for a lot of people is kind of a no-go area. Food is often a really strong part of people's kind of identity and freedom. So no one wants to be told what to eat. I think there are a couple of key trends there. I think the key for reducing pressure from food systems is to have really productive food systems, right? So if you have really high crop yields, you use less land to grow the same amount of food. Now, we have seen really promising trends there where, crop yields over the last 50 years have kind of increased, doubled, tripled, quadrupled across many, many countries. And I think there is still a yield gap there where we could significantly increase yields further. And I think the big food system shift we need is towards more plant-based diets. That would alleviate a lot of these
Why? Just explain why.
So basically producing meat is just a really inefficient way of producing protein. So when you feed a cow or chickens or pigs, most of the food that you actually feed them is kind of wasted, just keeping them alive. It's not actually converted into meat. So it's actually a very, very inefficient way of producing food at the end of the chain, which means we're using lots of farmland just to grow crops to then feed animals and getting very little meat out in return. So if you were to move to a more plant-based system, you could feasibly do that on much, much, much less land than we currently use. You'd probably have much, much less freshwater stress, water pollution. There are a range of benefits to moving to more plant-based diets. I think that transition is going to be very, very difficult. I find it hard to see how people will move away from meat unless they're moving to the same meat, but just without the animal. So that's where a lot of these kind of meat substitute or kind of lab-grown meat products come in. I would love if people would just move to lentils or beans or peas, but I just don't see it happening.
Is the food that is closest to you the most sustainable?
Not necessarily. I think this is a really big myth. I think if you ask people what's the most sustainable way or low carbon way to eat, they would focus on, eat local. And I think that's often the recommendation, is to eat local. That's not really true when you break down the data. Now, the rationale for that makes sense, right? We know that transporting stuff by truck or ship or flying emits CO2. So therefore, you'd assume the further it has to travel to reach you, obviously, it'll have a much higher carbon footprint.
And it needs to be refrigerated.
Yeah, exactly. The challenge there is that when you look at emissions from food systems, transport is only around 5%, right? Most of the emissions from food comes from like the land use change, so the deforestation or using the land, and emissions on the farm. So that's stuff like fertilizers, manure, tractors, the cows burping is another big one. So that's where most of the emissions come from. And the transport component for most foods is actually very, very small. Now, what that means is that what type of food you eat and how it's produced matters much, much more than how far it's traveled to reach you. So I think there's often the argument, my local beef is obviously more sustainable than your avocados shipped in from South America. But actually, the data just doesn't back that up, because even though they're shipped in from South America, that transport emission component is much, much less than the emissions from the cow, for example.
Right. What's the story you're telling on biodiversity?
I think much more pessimistic. I think this is the area where the good stories are kind of few and far between. Like if you look across, like globally across the world, like biodiversity, we are losing biodiversity, and we're losing biodiversity at a pretty fast rate. Like I think it's often framed as are we in the midst of a sixth mass extinction? And I think one way to compare that is so the world has had 5 mass extinctions before. One way that we can look at that is to look at the rate by which species are going extinct now and in the recent past, and compare that to rates in the previous 5. Now, when you do that, and I looked at the numbers, the rates are actually higher than they were in the previous 5 mass extinctions. The difference there is that to have a mass extinction, we would need to carry this on for a long, long, long period of time. And I guess where my sense of hope is that we are the handbrake in this mass extinction.
And just explain by what you mean by a long period of time. You're not talking 50 years, are you?
No, so the definition of a mass extinction is, losing like 75% of species over the course of 2 million years. So it's like well beyond what we'd think of in like human timescales, but on a geological timescale, that's pretty fast.
So just while we're talking about extinction, I mean, I did mention Extinction Rebellion earlier. What do you think of the use of that word and that idea in campaigning? Is it irresponsible?
I think part of it depends on how it's framed. I think if you're talking about extinction of species and the biosphere around us, I think that's very valid. Like we are losing species at an alarming rate. Those are going extinct, those species. I think if you frame it in kind of a human lens, I think I have some reservations about it. Like I support environmental activism. I actually think they've done a really good job of drawing attention to these environmental problems and putting climate change more on the radar. I think if you were to ask mainstream climate scientists, will humans go extinct from climate change, kind of on the timescales that we're talking about, they would say no, or most of them would say no.
So when you see young people, it's often teenagers saying, we don't have a future. It's not true, is it? I mean, on a simple level, it's,
On a broad frame, no, that's not correct. I think the key challenge there is, and I actually think that's a little bit what's lost in this framing of apocalyptic, we're all going to die from this, is that it really underplays the inequality and the climate change impacts in the world. The risk for a middle-class kid in the UK is so vastly different from the risks for someone in a low-income country near the equator. And I think when we tell this kind of overarching, it's almost framed as a kind of, we're all in this together, we're all kind of doomed together story, you really miss that large inequality. And my fear is that we actually don't focus on the kid in the low-income country that is actually at very, very high risk of severe climate impacts.
You come on to ocean plastics, which of course has really captured the public imagination, largely because of the Blue Planet series on television a few years ago. Again, that isn't quite as bad as a lot of people might think.
No, and I think if you asked, and I've spoken to kind of marine scientists, in some sense, some of them are a bit annoyed that plastics get so much attention. I think if you were to ask, many marine scientists, what's the biggest threat to our oceans and ocean life, plastic's actually pretty low on the list. They'd say one, climate change, like coral reefs are really high risk from climate change, especially at like 2 degrees. We're kind of looking at most coral reefs being struggling to survive, or kind of overfishing or fertilizers being poured into the oceans. So I think for many marine scientists, plastics is actually pretty low on the list.
How much plastic actually goes into the ocean?
There are a range of estimates, typically in the order of a few million tons a year, which sounds like a lot. When you look at the total amount of plastic waste we produce, that's actually not that much. It's probably around 0.5% of the plastic waste we produce every year goes into the ocean. I think what people get wrong about the plastic problem is that we focus a bit too much on how much plastic we're using. And we use that as a proxy for how much is going into the ocean. When in reality, the problem with plastics going into the ocean is not necessarily how much we're using, it's how it's managed at the end of the chain. So if you use a lot of plastic and it goes into landfill or it goes to recycling or it's incinerated, it's not at risk of going into the ocean. The challenge there is that plastic use, especially in many middle to low income countries, has increased a lot as people have got richer, but the waste management infrastructure is not there to then stop it from going into rivers or into the ocean. For example, we put a lot of focus on, the ban on plastic straws. Probably what would have been much more useful for the UK to do was to, one, stop exporting our waste to other countries that maybe don't have the waste management infrastructure to deal with it, or actually just to invest in waste management in other countries where they don't have that infrastructure. That would be way more effective than the kind of more visible, look at us, we're doing loads on plastics because we banned plastic straws.
Because if there's only 0.5% of waste plastic going into the ocean, then there's no reason why it can't all just be stopped.
Yeah,
proper waste management.
It's basically an investment problem. If you invested a significant amount of money into this, you could actually probably solve it pretty quickly. I think the challenge is it's maybe not really high on the priority list.
Okay. Overfishing you mentioned as a challenge for the ocean. Now, again, we sort of swing and sway as to sort of whether we think overfishing is a huge problem or not. Is it, or does it just depend where you are?
It largely depends on where you are. I mean, it is a significant problem globally. I think there've been some kind of headlines that have been like a little bit misleading. There's a kind of meme that, the oceans will be empty by 2050, and that's been reported a lot. And when you dig into the data and the research on that, that's not true. But that doesn't mean overfishing is not a problem, especially in kind of countries and regions where fish populations aren't monitored properly, or there's kind of dark zones in the ocean where we actually just don't know what's going on with fishing activity. You could probably assume there that overfishing rates are pretty high. Now, there are ways to sustainably fish and maintain fish populations, but you need to monitor that very closely, and you need to set really strong quotas on how much fishermen can catch. So again, there is the possibility that you can solve that problem. In many regions, we actually can do that quite effectively, but you would need to see a kind of wide rollout of that across the world.
Okay, I mean, those are the main topics in your book. I mean, I suppose all of them are areas that have been wildly covered by the media. So to what extent do you blame television, newspapers, mainstream media, before we get on to social media and misinformation, for the misconceptions that so many of us hold?
I think there's some level of responsibility there. I think there's two reasons for that. I think the media naturally wants a headline, and it wants a catchy headline. So that often leads us to these kind of extreme stories or results that immediately make it into the media and the headlines, but the kind of boring, probably the top.
Things quite bad, but only in the long term isn't such a great headline.
No, or it's a little bit complicated.
Yes.
It's not as simple. All of these issues I try to convey some nuance and balance in that, and that's just not that interesting as a headline. I've done loads of interviews on this, and every time I see the media headline on my interview, I'm like, oh no, because they've tried to pick a catchy one, and I'd want it to have a bunch of caveats around it. I think it's really good that media has put increasing attention on these problems. stories about climate change, risks of climate change. I think that's really, really good and really, really positive. I think the challenge there is if you only ever tell people about the problem, you lead them to a sense that there are no solutions and nothing good is happening on these challenges. And I think there is lots of good stuff, it's just not making the headlines.
Yeah.
So rather than saying, no, problem, 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 it would be good to say, this is the problem, because we need to keep our eye on that and we need to be aware of what's at stake. But here are solutions and this is what's actually happening.
I mean, of course, most young people are getting a lot of this information now from TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, where a lot of that content is just served up to you. And you don't really, there's nobody really curating it. It's the algorithm based on what else you've been watching. That makes it quite a dangerous space, doesn't it, for information?
I think it makes a dangerous space kind of at both extremes. Like it almost pushes people towards the extremes where you can get stuck in, I guess, a little bit of a doom loop where if you're looking at, really extreme climate scenarios and you focus on them, then
it'll just keep serving up more.
Keep serving it, and you just get the sense that everything's getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. At the other end, I guess if you're looking at more like skeptical, kind of denial type stories, I guess you're probably going to get served that again and again and again and again. So yes, I think the challenge there is that you end up with this really polarizing discussion. I mean, coming back to the media, I think that's also like a little bit of the issue I have often with these debates where often you will find people at extremes debating one another and the real answer lies in the middle. And I think that's actually just not helpful to the audience because they come away with that with, to me, very...
It's that or that.
And the reality is it's neither. And I think it's really hard for people without a climate background or a background in these topics to know where in the middle at all the truth lies. So I think I'd rather than having this, it might be entertaining to have people from extremes, but actually not serving the audience very well. And I'd rather they had experts with a bit more nuance, which might not be as exciting, but actually does its job in conveying important information to the public.
So I don't know if you've got cousins or siblings or whatever, but I mean, what's your advice to them, when it comes to social media and facts and science? Ignore it? Stay away from it?
I think having a more moderate media diet is useful. I think you can get into this pattern where you're just saying, bad story after bad story after bad story. I think it's important to be aware of what's going on and the disasters that are happening. But I think it's also really important to then immerse yourself into, okay, this bad stuff's happening. What can I do about it? How do I get involved and work with people that are working on solutions? I think for me, coming from a background where I was really anxious about this topic and still am really anxious about it, I think one of the key antidotes is taking action, feeling like you're part of something that's actually driving positive change. Fear can actually be a good motivator to get people involved and engaged in a topic. And for some people, that actually works. But for many of the people that I speak to, they're not out there taking action. They're kind of doom scrolling and they're not investing in their future and actually not contributing to trying to solve the problem. So I think my key would be to keep one kind of point on the radar so you can understand what's going on, but also get involved in something that drive us forward.
And you still believe in activism?
Yeah, I still believe in activism. And the government needs to know what the public cares about. I think there's just various forms of activism. One is, the very visible activism that we see out there. And to be clear, I think activism really has put this much, much more on the agenda for people and much, much higher on the priority list. I guess my question around activism and how we frame this issue is that I think if you look at the UK and survey data, most of the UK are concerned about climate change. They care about climate change. In some sense, that's a success, right? Maybe activism has actually driven quite a lot of that. The question then is that if that's the message that's got us from A to B, is that necessarily the message that gets us from B to C, which is not only having people concerned about it, but actually taking action. And if you want to move from B to C, maybe we need a slightly different message, which is framed less around, this is a really big problem, this is really serious, into what are the opportunities that we create by moving to low carbon energy? What are the economic opportunities? What are the job opportunities? What are the opportunities for health? So I think we need to think more about what that messaging is and how it would relate in different stages of the process of us moving to a low carbon economy.
And if you could change the world in any way, wave a magic wand, what would you do?
I would create a really cheap, abundant, low carbon energy source. it would solve our climate change problem. It would save millions of a year from air pollution. There's so many of our other problems where energy is the kind of binding constraint. It would lift billions of people out of energy poverty and massively improve their standard of living. Even problems such as water stress, like desalination, the issue and binding constraint there is energy. Growing food where it's really exposed to weather and disasters. With energy, you could produce that indoors or on much, much less land. So I think there are a range of problems that we face today where the binding constraint is energy. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have this century is to create a really cheap, abundant, low carbon source. And I think we're getting there. I just hope that we make much, much faster progress.
Hannah Ritchie, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.